My taxi driver video. Okay, here we go. This film aged absurdly well. They ripped it off for that Joker garbage, essentially, or Scorsese's works in general, and it was really cynically tapping into something real amongst young men at that time. It just did a totally awful job of it. Scorsese's Taxi Driver remains a daunting masterpiece of cinematic execution, as a piece of motion photography if nothing else, but even its screenplay is the stuff of utter legend, distilling the more pathologically vengeful and unstable of the baby boomer generation, and in a manner that still felt highly relevant to subsequent outcasts from Generation X, late millennials, and early Gen Z. The distinction was whether Travis Bickle was perceived as a wake-up call, as certain viewers from Bickle's own generation presumably felt, an iconic though undeniably extreme, though relatable figure for the Generation X audience, though perhaps too proclaimed as an idol, along with Zack Snyder's interpretation of Alan Moore's Rorschach as a righteous crusader who wanted to clean up the surrounding environment of perceived degeneracy, criminality, and aberrant apathetic immorality, and the ignoring of it from the elite authorities and law enforcement institutions of that decaying metropolis. Where the Gen Z, almost my generation, I was born in '96, perception is concerned, seemingly. The real punch of Taxi Driver are the areas in which we, as males, find ourselves relating to Travis, wherever it is in our smitten emotions towards some enchanting woman, a desire for justice and for some prospectively selfless sea change instead of the highly indifferent callousness of his surrounding streets, and a willingness to embark upon essentially vigilante justice, fighting back against bullies, criminals, or even the political establishment itself, where the big difference is for Bickle, it is more than a mere power fantasy, which is never truly considered as a practical or just moral action, whereas Travis boldly did that. Taxi Driver's prospective misinterpretation became very clear to the world when Hinckley Jr. tried to murder Reagan in 1981. That film was having an impact, but it was Reagan, so some weren't so fussed about that removal being damaging to the society at large. No, seriously. But we can consider how much damage, more damage, that head of state did to America than Bickle ever could have possibly. The world has been comfortable and open to the idea that Taxi Driver could be misinterpreted for decades, and never has it been widely fashionable to call it problematic, even as some of Scorsese's later features, or at least Wolf of Wall Street, were questioned for their not-so-subtle celebration of the attributes of male behavior it claims to be criticizing. Taxi Driver was so resolute in its eventual depiction of Travis as an unadmirable, overstepping, unstable aggressor, and frankly, whilst the film presents Travis as potentially relatable, initially, unassumingly clever, and with some sense of a consistent, at one time, moral code, it never portrays him as entertaining, aspirationally, or as aesthetically cool, not in the way that Snyder's, or just Moore and Gibbons's, take on Rorschach was, as Johnny in Mike Leigh's Naked kind of is, in my view. Check out my video on Mike Leigh's Naked for more elaboration. For as much as I do like that particular film, it is not on the teenage boys solely for, if they do, thinking Johnny is cool. It is partly on Leigh being a little bit irresponsible or absent-minded in his want to make Johnny a watchable individual. Or, as the meritless Joker Phoenix films absolutely are. Actually, Travis Bickle is almost Alex Delage from Clockwork Orange, in reverse partially. Alex becomes sympathetic later on in the runtime, Travis becomes less so as the film progresses, and whilst Clockwork Orange was arguably glorying in the subversiveness of violent content just a little too much, considering it was attempting to morally condemn violence itself, quite clearly, not to take away from that film's accomplishments, technically is pristine Kubrick and deserves classic status for this reasoning alone, I would state. I don't feel as though Taxi Driver is as questionable in the same way. In Taxi Driver, I think it really is on us for finding Travis to be likable or relatable, because not many people, or not everyone does. Many react to Travis with shock and horror, either because they're from the upper classes and are out of touch, not that being in touch would have them feeling any more kinship with Travis in anything but a designated abstract, because there may be non-white groups in a Western nation who perceive Travis as a future or submerged, violent racist amidst incubation, or because they are a woman, and I don't think many women relate to Travis Bickle too much. If they do, they drop out long before we, the aggrieved men, tend to do. I always felt as though the film after the police arrive upon the scene of the crime, Travis's bloody vigilante spree, is a fantasy in a dying Travis's mind. Why? One, it makes the film better. The realist, brutal Taxi Driver becoming a Paddy Chayefsky-esque hyper-satire is incredibly disappointing in my view. And two, because it makes no sense. It is too tonally out of place and contrived cinematic, that he doesn't look at who is in his back seat, that it is Betsy at that, and as she happens upon his taxi specifically. It is so tonally out of place that it must be a dream, in my own opinion at least. Almost definitely the masterpiece of Scorsese, although I also wholly appreciate Mean Streets, Raging Bull, King of Comedy, and especially my plausible second favourite, After Hours. Sadly, not only do I consider 21st century Scorsese to be generally quite disappointing, but 90s onwards Scorsese also. Whilst I am very fond of Goodfellas and also Age of Innocence, I have no time for the rest of his 90s work, though maybe Cape Fear is worth revisiting as one note kitsch horror, if nothing else maybe, and I'll stick up for Departed, Hugo, and Silence in the 21st century, though two of those films are inferior remakes. Well, second adaptation of a novel in the case of 2016 Silence, which is a bit awkward for such an acclaimed auteur, I feel. I'm totally on board with Taxi Driver, although I don't like the bro association with this film where it does exist. It exists more broadly with other Scorsese films, clearly, although if it gets younger, dumber men onto more exciting films or shooting American presidents, then well, maybe so be it. Travis Bickle is arguably the best film character who did not originate in a novel or play prior. You'll be hard pressed naming other utterly brilliant film characters who did not originate in another source prior, though feel free to name any if you are ever so inclined. Thank you and good night, once again.